The evening started like any other in downtown Chicago, with the city lights reflecting off the wet streets after a light autumn rain. Judge Patricia Morrison was driving home from a long day at the federal courthouse, where she had presided over several important cases. She was tired but satisfied with the day's work, thinking about the warm cup of tea waiting for her at home. Her black Mercedes moved smoothly through the traffic, carefully following all traffic rules as she always did. The clock on her dashboard showed 7:30 p.m. when she noticed the flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. With years of legal experience, she knew exactly what to do. She signaled properly and pulled over to the right side of the road, positioning her car safely away from the traffic. Officer James Barrett watched the expensive car pull over. He had been having a rough day, dealing with what he considered difficult people in this upscale neighborhood. When he saw the Mercedes with its tinted windows, something about it bothered him. He couldn't quite explain why he decided to follow it, but he did. As he approached the car, Barrett noticed the driver was a well-dressed black woman in her 50s. She sat perfectly still, both hands visible on the steering wheel, just as drivers are taught to do. Something about her calm confidence irritated him. In his 8 years on the force, Barrett had developed certain prejudices he wouldn't admit to having. "License and registration," he barked, shining his flashlight directly into her face, even though the street was well lit. His tone was unnecessarily harsh, a fact that didn't escape Judge Morrison's notice. With deliberate movements, she reached for her documents. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Her voice was steady and professional, the same tone she used in her courtroom. She handed over her license and registration through the partially opened window. Barrett barely glanced at the documents. "You were swerving," he claimed, though they both knew this wasn't true. Judge Morrison had been driving perfectly, and her dashcam would later prove this. "I respectfully disagree, officer," she replied calmly. "I've been driving very carefully, and I'm certain I maintained my lane at all times." She spoke clearly but quietly, maintaining her composure despite the officer's increasingly aggressive stance. Barrett's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people questioning him, especially not with such self-assurance. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his hand moving to rest on his weapon, an unnecessary gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Judge Morrison. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his nameplate, "I don't believe that's necessary. I'm simply asking for clarification about why I was stopped. If you could explain the specific traffic violation you observed, I'd appreciate it." Her reasonable request and knowledge of her rights seemed to anger him further. The rain had started again, light drops falling on his uniform, but he hardly noticed. His face grew red as he leaned closer to her window. "Listen here," he growled. "I don't know who you think you are, but when I give an order, you follow it. Now step out of the vehicle." Judge Morrison remained calm but firm. "Officer, I believe this stop may be motivated by factors other than any traffic violation. I'm happy to comply with reasonable requests, but I'm also aware of my rights as a citizen." She reached for her phone, intending to document the interaction, which was her legal right. Barrett mistook this movement as a threat, despite her clear announcement. "Officer, I'm reaching for my phone to record this interaction." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other cars passed by slowly, their headlights illuminating the scene in brief flashes. A few pedestrians had stopped to watch from a safe distance, sensing that something was wrong about this traffic stop. Little did Officer Barrett know that this routine traffic stop would soon become anything but routine. He had no idea that the woman he was treating with such disrespect was one of the most respected federal judges in the city, known for her fair rulings and dedication to justice. As he stood there in the light rain, his anger building at what he perceived as defiance, he was moments away from making the biggest mistake of his career. The situation at the traffic stop took a dark turn as Officer Barrett's anger reached its boiling point. Rain continued to fall softly around them, and the evening traffic created a steady background noise of passing cars and distant horns. The officer's flashlight beam remained fixed on Judge Morrison's face, creating harsh shadows in the car's interior. "I've had enough of your attitude," Barrett snapped, his voice growing louder with each word. He could feel his control of the situation slipping away, and it made him even angrier. The small crowd of onlookers had grown to about 7 people, all holding their phones up, recording the scene from a safe distance. Judge Morrison remained steady, her hands still visible on the steering wheel. Officer Barrett, I understand you're doing your job, but I must inform you that your current behavior appears to be discriminatory. I would be happy to discuss this with your supervisor. Her measured response and mention of a supervisor pushed Barrett over the edge. In his 8 years on the force, no one had ever so calmly challenged his authority. His face turned a deeper shade of red, visible even in the dim evening light. You people always think you know the law better than us, he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth as he spoke. Always talking about discrimination when you're the ones breaking the rules. Judge Morrison's dashboard camera captured everything that happened next. Officer Barrett, in a moment of uncontrolled rage, deliberately leaned closer to her partially opened window. Then, in full view of the gathering crowd and various recording devices, he did the unthinkable. He spat directly in her face. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people shouted in protest. Judge Morrison sat perfectly still, the officer's saliva running down her cheek. She didn't move to wipe it away, understanding the importance of preserving evidence. Now you can add assault of a federal judge to your list of violations, Officer Barrett, she stated quietly, her voice unwavering despite the humiliation she had just endured. Barrett laughed dismissively. Yeah, right. And I'm the President of the United States. His sarcasm dripped with contempt as he reached for his radio to call for backup, convinced she was lying about being a judge. Judge Morrison took this moment to reach for her federal judge credentials that were in her briefcase on the passenger seat. She moved slowly and announced each action. I am now reaching for my federal judicial identification. Stop moving, Barrett yelled, his hand now resting on his weapon again. The crowd moved closer, their phones still recording, concerned about the escalating situation. Officer Barrett, Judge Morrison spoke clearly, making sure her words were captured by all recording devices. You have just committed assault against a federal judge. I am Judge Patricia Morrison of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. I suggest you step back from my vehicle and wait for your backup to arrive. Barrett's face went through a series of emotions, disbelief, shock, and then fear as he processed her words. He quickly stepped back from the car, his boots splashing in a small puddle. His hand dropped from his weapon as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, their lights adding to the chaos of colors reflecting off the wet pavement. Barrett stood frozen, watching as his career crumbled around him. The small crowd had grown larger, and several people were live streaming the incident. One of the arriving officers, Sergeant Sarah Martinez, approached the scene and immediately recognized Judge Morrison from her numerous appearances in the media and her reputation in the legal community. The color drained from Barrett's face as he heard Sergeant Martinez say, "Good evening, Your Honor. Are you all right?" Judge Morrison finally reached for a tissue from her car's console and carefully wiped her face, making sure to preserve some of the saliva on the tissue as evidence. She looked directly at Officer Barrett, who now stood trembling slightly in the rain, and said firmly, "No, Sergeant Martinez, I am not all right. And Officer Barrett here has some serious explaining to do." The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully orchestrated drama on the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. Judge Morrison remained in her car, her phone now recording everything while Sergeant Martinez took control of the situation. The crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people, their phones creating a sea of glowing screens in the growing darkness. Officer Barrett stood off to the side, looking like a deflated balloon. His earlier bravado had disappeared completely, replaced by a nervous twitch in his left eye. He kept wiping his hands on his uniform pants, leaving dark wet marks on the blue fabric. Every few minutes, he would glance at Judge Morrison's car, then quickly look away, like a child caught doing something wrong. Sergeant Martinez approached Judge Morrison's window with respect and professionalism, everything Barrett had failed to show. "Your Honor, would you please tell me exactly what happened?" She held a small notebook, ready to document everything. Judge Morrison's voice remained steady as she recounted the events. "I would like to file formal charges of assault," she stated clearly. "I also want a full investigation into Officer Barrett's past conduct. This level of bias and aggression suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident." 2 more senior officers arrived at the scene, followed by an internal affairs representative who had been called immediately given the severity of the situation. They gathered around Sergeant Martinez as she briefed them, their faces growing more serious with each detail. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with clips from the incident. The hashtag Judge Morrison was already trending locally, and news vans were beginning to arrive at the scene, the bright lights cutting through the misty rain. Judge Morrison used this time to make several important phone calls. First, she contacted her clerk to document everything while it was fresh in her mind. Then she called the chief judge of her district to inform him of the situation. Finally, she reached out to her longtime friend and civil rights attorney, Marcus Thompson. Document everything, Thompson advised over the phone. Every detail matters. How's your dashcam footage? Running since the moment he turned on his lights, she replied, her years of legal experience guiding her actions. I also have tissue samples preserved from when he spat at me, and at least 20 witnesses with video recordings. The Internal Affairs representative, Detective Lisa Wam, approached Judge Morrison's car next. Your Honor, we take this incident extremely seriously. We'll need your statement, and we'd like to collect any evidence you have preserved. As Judge Morrison handed over the sealed tissue sample, she noticed Officer Barrett being escorted to a separate police car. His head hung low, and his shoulders slumped forward. It was a stark contrast to his aggressive posture just an hour ago. Several witnesses came forward voluntarily, eager to share their videos and statements. One young woman, a law student who had recognized Judge Morrison from a lecture she had given, was particularly detailed in her account. The officer was aggressive from the start, the law student told Detective Wong. Judge Morrison remained completely professional while he became increasingly hostile. Then She paused. Still shocked by what she had witnessed, he spat right in her face. Local news reporters were now setting up their equipment, preparing for live broadcasts. Judge Morrison knew this incident would be all over the morning news. She wasn't concerned about the publicity. In fact, she believed it might help bring attention to a serious problem. Sergeant Martinez returned to Judge Morrison's car one final time. Your Honor, we've secured Officer Barrett's body camera and patrol car footage. We'll need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint. Would you like an escort? Judge Morrison nodded, gathering her belongings. As she stepped out of her car for the first time since the incident began, the crowd of onlookers fell silent. She stood tall, her dignity intact despite the horrible experience she had just endured. Looking directly at the news cameras, she made a brief statement. What happened here tonight is not about me being a judge. It's about the need for accountability and the importance of treating every citizen with respect. This incident will be handled through proper legal channels. As she walked to her car to follow Sergeant Martinez to the station, the crowd spontaneously began to applaud. Judge Morrison knew that while this night had been traumatic, it would serve a greater purpose in the ongoing fight for justice and equality. The police station buzzed with unusual energy that evening. Word had spread quickly through the department about what had happened, and officers kept finding excuses to walk past the conference room where Judge Morrison sat with Detective Wong and her legal team. The judge's presence created a mixture of respect and nervous tension throughout the building. Officer Barrett sat alone in a small interview room down the hall, still in his uniform but without his badge and gun, which had been taken as part of the investigation. His hands shook slightly as he filled out his incident report. Every few minutes, he would crumple up the paper and start over, knowing his career and freedom might depend on how he explained his actions. Police Chief Michael Richardson arrived at the station in a hurry, his tie slightly crooked and his usual neat appearance somewhat disheveled. He had been at his daughter's piano recital when he received the call about the incident. As he walked briskly through the station, officers moved out of his way, recognizing the serious expression on his face. "Where is she?" he asked Sergeant Martinez, who was waiting by his office. "Conference room A, sir," Martinez replied, falling into step beside him. "She's with Detective Wong and her attorney. And sir," Martinez lowered her voice, "it's worse than we initially thought. The body cam footage is clear, and there are at least 30 witness videos circulating online already." Chief Richardson stopped walking for a moment, closing his eyes briefly. And Barrett? What was he thinking? "He claims he didn't know who she was," Martinez explained, "but that's hardly the point. The way he treated her. Sir, it was textbook racial profiling, followed by assault." They reached the conference room, where Judge Morrison sat reviewing her statement. She looked up as they entered, and Chief Richardson immediately recognized her from numerous legal proceedings where she had presided. He had testified in her courtroom multiple times over the years, always admiring her fair and thorough approach to justice. "Your Honor," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for what happened tonight." Judge Morrison nodded acknowledgement but remained professional. "Chief Richardson, I believe we need to discuss not just tonight's incident, but the larger issues it represents. Officer Barrett's behavior didn't develop in a vacuum." Meanwhile, down the hall, Officer Barrett was finally learning more about the judge he had assaulted. A junior officer had placed a newspaper article in front of him, showing Judge Morrison receiving an award for her work in civil rights law before becoming a federal judge. Barrett's face turned pale as he read about her 20 years on the federal bench, her hundreds of landmark decisions, and her reputation for fairness and integrity. "She's handled some of the biggest cases in Chicago's history," the junior officer said, unable to hide his disgust with Barrett. "She sentenced corrupt cops before, ones who abused their power." Barrett pushed the article away, feeling sick to his stomach. Through the small window in the interview room, he could see more officers gathering in the hallway, many looking at him with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His actions had not only ruined his own career, but had brought shame to the entire department. Back in the conference room, Judge Morrison was sharing her concerns with Chief Richardson. "This isn't just about me," she explained, her voice firm but calm. "I want a full review of Officer Barrett's past arrests and traffic stops. I suspect we'll find a pattern of similar behavior toward minorities." Chief Richardson nodded, knowing she was probably right. "We'll conduct a thorough investigation, Your Honor. Complete transparency." "Good," she replied, "because tomorrow morning, this story will be everywhere. Your department's response will be crucial." As if on cue, phones throughout the station began buzzing with news alerts. The story had already reached national news networks, and social media was exploding with the video clips. Outside the station, news vans were setting up their equipment for the morning broadcasts. Judge Morrison gathered her belongings, preparing to leave. "Chief Richardson," she said, standing up, "I expect to see meaningful changes come from this incident. Sometimes it takes a spark to light the fire of reform." As she walked out of the station, officers and staff members stood respectfully, watching her pass. She had entered their station as a victim of assault, but she was leaving as a catalyst for change. The real work was just beginning. The Chicago Police Department's press conference room had never been so crowded. 1 week after the incident, Chief Richardson stood at the podium, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the sweat on his forehead as he prepared to address the public. "Good morning," he began, his voice firm but humbled. "Today, I stand before you to address not just one incident of misconduct, but a pattern of systemic failures within our department that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked." In the front row, Detective Wong sat with her complete investigation report, a thick binder filled with evidence of Officer Barrett's past misconduct. Behind her, representatives from various civil rights organizations and community leaders filled the rows of seats. The tension in the room was palpable. "Our investigation has revealed that Officer James Barrett engaged in discriminatory practices throughout his career," Chief Richardson continued. "We have documented evidence of racial profiling in over 200 traffic stops, multiple instances of excessive force, and numerous citizen complaints that were improperly dismissed." The reporter's hands shot up immediately, but the chief held up his hand to continue. "As of this morning, Officer Barrett has been officially terminated from the Chicago Police Department. But that's just the beginning of our response." Meanwhile, across town at the federal courthouse, Judge Morrison watched the press conference on her office television. Her clerk, James Chen, took notes as the chief outlined the department's comprehensive reform plan. "They're actually doing it," Chen said with surprise. "They're implementing all the changes you recommended." Judge Morrison nodded, her expression serious. The chief was announcing a series of major reforms: mandatory body cameras with automatic activation during all stops, a new civilian oversight committee with real power, and enhanced bias training led by civil rights experts. Back at the press conference, Chief Richardson revealed more findings. "Our internal audit showed that Officer Barrett was not acting alone. We have identified 5 other officers with similar patterns of misconduct. All of them have been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending further investigation. The reporters furiously typed on their laptops and phones as the chief continued. He announced the creation of a new internal affairs division specifically focused on bias-related complaints, with Detective Wong appointed as its head. In a small apartment on the city's south side, Officer Barrett watched the press conference on his TV, his face pale and drawn. His union representative had already informed him that they wouldn't be defending him against the criminal charges. The evidence was too overwhelming, the case too public, and his actions too indefensible. Furthermore, Chief Richardson's voice boomed through the TV speakers. We are reopening every case where Officer Barrett's conduct may have led to wrongful arrests or convictions. Our preliminary review suggests this could affect hundreds of cases dating back 8 years. The announcement sent a ripple through the legal community. In law offices across Chicago, attorneys began pulling files, preparing to challenge old convictions and arrests made by Barrett. At the podium, Chief Richardson introduced the members of the new Oversight Committee, a diverse group of community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights activists. Their first task would be to review the department's hiring and promotion practices. We're also implementing immediate changes to our training programs, the chief announced. Starting next week, every officer will undergo enhanced bias recognition training. We've partnered with leading experts in the field, including several civil rights organizations. Detective Wong smiled slightly as she heard this. She had helped design the new training program, incorporating real examples from Barrett's case to show officers exactly what discriminatory policing looked like and how to recognize their own potential biases. As the press conference concluded, Chief Richardson made one final announcement. Lastly, we want to publicly apologize to Judge Morrison and to every citizen who has experienced discrimination at the hands of our officers. We can't change the past, but we can and will do better going forward. The room erupted with questions from reporters, but the message was clear. The Chicago Police Department was undergoing a major transformation, and Officer Barrett's act of prejudice had become the catalyst for real change. The department's response had turned a moment of shame into an opportunity for meaningful reform. The Chicago Police Department's press conference room had never been so crowded. 1 week after the incident, Chief Richardson stood at the podium, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the sweat on his forehead as he prepared to address the public. "Good morning," he began, his voice firm but humbled. "Today, I stand before you to address not just one incident of misconduct, but a pattern of systemic failures within our department that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked." In the front row, Detective Wong sat with her complete investigation report, a thick binder filled with evidence of Officer Barrett's past misconduct. Behind her, representatives from various civil rights organizations and community leaders filled the rows of seats. The tension in the room was palpable. Our investigation has revealed that Officer James Barrett engaged in discriminatory practices throughout his career, Chief Richardson continued. We have documented evidence of racial profiling in over 200 traffic stops, multiple instances of excessive force, and numerous citizen complaints that were improperly dismissed. The reporter's hands shot up immediately, but the chief held up his hand to continue. As of this morning, Officer Barrett has been officially terminated from the Chicago Police Department. But that's just the beginning of our response. Meanwhile, across town at the federal courthouse, Judge Morrison watched the press conference on her office television. Her clerk, James Chen, took notes as the chief outlined the department's comprehensive reform plan. "They're actually doing it," Chen said with surprise. "They're implementing all the changes you recommended." Judge Morrison nodded, her expression serious. The chief was announcing a series of major reforms. Mandatory body cameras with automatic activation during all stops, a new civilian oversight committee with real power, and enhanced bias training led by civil rights experts. Back at the press conference, Chief Richardson revealed more findings. Our internal audit showed that Officer Barrett was not acting alone. We have identified 5 other officers with similar patterns of misconduct. All of them have been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending further investigation. The reporters furiously typed on their laptops and phones as the chief continued. He announced the creation of a new internal affairs division specifically focused on bias-related complaints, with Detective Wong appointed as its head. In a small apartment on the city's south side, Officer Barrett watched the press conference on his TV, his face pale and drawn. His union representative had already informed him that they wouldn't be defending him against the criminal charges. The evidence was too overwhelming, the case too public, and his actions too indefensible. Furthermore, Chief Richardson's voice boomed through the TV speakers. "We are reopening every case where Officer Barrett's conduct may have led to wrongful arrests or convictions. Our preliminary review suggests this could affect hundreds of cases dating back 8 years." The announcement sent a ripple through the legal community. In law offices across Chicago, attorneys began pulling files, preparing to challenge old convictions and arrests made by Barrett. At the podium, Chief Richardson introduced the members of the new Oversight Committee, a diverse group of community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights activists. Their first task would be to review the department's hiring and promotion practices. "We're also implementing immediate changes to our training programs," the chief announced. "Starting next week, every officer will undergo enhanced bias recognition training. We've partnered with leading experts in the field, including several civil rights organizations." Detective Wong smiled slightly as she heard this. She had helped design the new training program, incorporating real examples from Barrett's case to show officers exactly what discriminatory policing looked like and how to recognize their own potential biases. As the press conference concluded, Chief Richardson made one final announcement. "Lastly, we want to publicly apologize to Judge Morrison and to every citizen who has experienced discrimination at the hands of our officers. We can't change the past. We can, and will do better going forward." The room erupted with questions from reporters, but the message was clear. The Chicago Police Department was undergoing a major transformation, and Officer Barrett's act of prejudice had become the catalyst for real change. The department's response had turned a moment of shame into an opportunity for meaningful reform. The downtown courthouse was packed on the morning of Officer Barrett's criminal hearing. The case had caught national attention, and every seat in the courtroom was filled. Journalists sat in the front row with their notepads ready, while civil rights activists and community members filled the remaining spaces. Barrett sat at the defendant's table, wearing a dark gray suit that seemed too big for his now thinner frame. The past month had taken its toll on him. His face was gaunt, and gray hairs had started appearing at his temples. His new criminal defense attorney, paid for by selling his house, sat beside him reviewing last-minute documents. Judge Sarah Chen, specially appointed from another district to avoid any conflict of interest, entered the courtroom. Everyone rose as she took her place at the bench. Unlike many high-profile cases, this one would move quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and Barrett had agreed to plead guilty to assault and civil rights violations. "All rise. Criminal Case 2025 CR 789, State of Illinois versus James Barrett," the bailiff announced. In the gallery, Detective Wong sat with Chief Richardson, both present to show that the police department supported the prosecution. Behind them sat Marcus Thompson, Judge Morrison's friend and civil rights attorney, who had helped coordinate the broader civil rights case that would follow. Judge Morrison herself was not present. She had recused herself from any direct involvement in the criminal proceedings, choosing instead to focus on working with legislators to draft new police accountability laws. At that very moment, she was meeting with state representatives in Springfield about a bill that would become known as the Morrison Act. "Mr. Barrett," Judge Chen spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, "you understand that by pleading guilty to these charges, you face up to 5 years in prison and will never again be eligible to serve as a law enforcement officer in any jurisdiction." Barrett's voice cracked as he responded, "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor, State Attorney Rachel Martinez, stood to present the case details. She described not just the assault on Judge Morrison, but the pattern of discriminatory behavior uncovered during the investigation. The courtroom remained silent as she played selected video clips from Barrett's body camera, showing multiple instances of racial profiling and aggressive behavior. "The state recommends 3 years imprisonment," Martinez concluded, "along with mandatory participation in racial bias counseling and community service with organizations serving minority communities." Barrett's attorney spoke briefly about his client's previously clean record and his acceptance of responsibility. but everyone in the courtroom knew the sentence was already decided through plea negotiations. Meanwhile, across town at the state capitol, Judge Morrison was making progress. She stood before the state legislature's Judiciary Committee, her presence commanding attention as she testified about the need for stronger police accountability measures. "This isn't about punishment," she explained to the lawmakers. "It's about prevention. We need systems in place that identify problematic behavior before it escalates to the point of assault or worse." Back in the courtroom, Judge Chen was ready to deliver the sentence. Barrett stood, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the judge. "Mr. Barrett," Judge Chen began, "your actions reflect a disturbing reality that we as a society must address. You betrayed not only your badge but the basic human dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their race or status." The sentence was delivered. 3 years in prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. Barrett would also have to complete 500 hours of community service and undergo extensive racial bias counseling. As he was led away in handcuffs, several people in the gallery wiped away tears, not for Barrett, but for what his case represented. Outside the courthouse, Chief Richardson addressed the waiting media. "Today's sentence sends a clear message," he stated firmly. "No one is above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it." Detective Wong, standing nearby, checked her phone and smiled. She had just received a message. The state legislature had scheduled a vote on the Morrison Act for next week. The law would require all police departments in Illinois to implement bias recognition programs, civilian oversight boards, and mandatory reporting of all traffic stop demographics. What had started as one officer's act of prejudice was transforming into lasting change. Barrett would serve his time, but more importantly, his case was becoming a catalyst for reform that would affect police departments across the entire state. 1 year had passed since that rainy evening when Officer Barrett made the worst decision of his life. The Chicago spring brought warm sunshine to the steps of the police academy, where Judge Morrison stood at a podium addressing the newest class of police recruits. Behind her, a banner read, "First Graduate Class of the Morrison Police Reform Program." The young officers sat straight in their chairs, listening intently as she spoke about accountability and justice. They were the first class to complete the new training program, which included extensive work with community organizations and real-world scenarios focusing on bias recognition. "Your badge is not a shield from responsibility," Judge Morrison told them, her voice carrying across the academy grounds. "It is a symbol of your commitment to protect and serve everyone equally." In the audience, Detective Wong, now Commissioner Wong, nodded in agreement. Her promotion to head the new Police Accountability Commission had led to significant changes in how officer misconduct was handled. The wall of pins in her old office had been transformed into a teaching tool, showing new officers how to recognize patterns of discriminatory behavior. Meanwhile, in a minimum security prison 60 miles away, James Barrett sat in a classroom of his own. As part of his sentence, he taught other inmates about his experience, using his story as a warning about the consequences of unchecked bias and abuse of power. The once proud officer had found a new purpose in helping others recognize and address their prejudices. "I never saw myself as racist," he told his class that day, his prison uniform a constant reminder of how wrong he had been. "But my actions told a different story. It took losing everything for me to understand that." Back at the police academy ceremony, Chief Richardson presented the new graduates with their badges. Each one had completed 3 times the amount of bias training required by the old standards. More importantly, they had spent months working directly with community organizations, building relationships with the people they would serve. "Remember," the chief said as he pinned on each badge, "you're not just joining a police force, you're joining a community." The Morrison Act, now law for 6 months, had already shown promising results across the state. Traffic stop data showed a significant decrease in racial profiling, and civilian complaints were being addressed more quickly and thoroughly. Other states had begun adopting similar legislation, using Illinois as a model for police reform. In her chambers at the federal courthouse, Judge Morrison kept a framed newspaper article on her wall. The headline read, "From Moment of Shame to Movement for Change." She often looked at it while working on cases, remembering how a terrible experience had led to positive transformation. Her clerk, James Chen, entered with the latest statistics from the Police Accountability Commission. "The numbers are encouraging, Your Honor," he said, laying the report on her desk. Civilian complaints are down 40%, and officer-involved incidents have decreased by 60%. Across the city, community leaders noticed the changes. Local activist Maria Rodriguez, who had once organized protests against police brutality, now worked alongside officers in community outreach programs. "We're not saying everything is perfect," she told a local news reporter, "but we're seeing real progress." The case had become required reading at police academies nationwide. Law enforcement training centers used the body camera footage and subsequent investigation to teach future officers about the importance of unbiased policing and the consequences of misconduct. Even the location of the original traffic stop had been transformed. The city had installed a small memorial plaque there, not to commemorate the incident itself, but to mark the beginning of meaningful change. It read, "On this spot, our community chose justice over silence, progress over prejudice." As Judge Morrison concluded her speech to the Academy graduates, she looked out at their young, eager faces. "Your true power lies not in your authority," she told them, "but in your ability to serve justice equally and fairly to all." The applause that followed was more than just politeness. It was a recognition of how far they had come and a commitment to how far they still needed to go. As the new officers rose to take their oath, the sun caught their badges, each one a promise to do better than those who came before them.